Have you ever discovered the most epic place for a time lapse, only to shoot it after all of your setup and have it turn out a bit like this? Flickery, bumpy. Really, the wind had it going there with the drone, but it doesn't matter if you're shooting with the drone or with a DSLR. You get two problems: variable exposure and stabilization. Well, here's how to fix it with LRTimelapse and DaVinci Resolve. Alright, as we get fired up with this, first thing we need to do is download LRTimelapse, which is available at lrtimelapse.com/download. Links below. It's the free version. You can edit up to 400 clips and do it in full HD. Okay, hold up. It struck me as I was working this that it was going to get very complicated very quickly. So let's start by looking at the big picture. The first problem we said we're solving is variable exposure. That's corrected through a dance between LRTimelapse and Lightroom. Now, LRTimelapse and Lightroom are not affiliated with each other. They talk to each other through the computer file system using metadata files called XMP files. The general workflow goes back and forth between LRTimelapse and Lightroom repeatedly. The screen's showing you the steps now. I'm going to walk through these one by one, but I want you to have a frame that you can screenshot so that you can use it as a reference after watching the video. Effectively, you're going to work on keyframes in LRTimelapse, you're going to edit them in Lightroom, you're going to load them back into LRTimelapse, and you're going to allow LRTimelapse to set the transition points for you. You'll then load them back into Lightroom, and in Lightroom you will export them to JPEG images. There's some steps you have to go through as you go through each of these in sequence. So we'll go through them one by one. But I'd highly recommend you screenshot this right here, right now. Okay, but let's clear out the nonsense. Our first job is to load the photos and choose the keyframes. Now that we've got the product installed and open, you'll notice I navigate to the location that I have a directory with all of my shots in it. Now these shots should be in sequence and named accordingly. It loads them all up, and you'll notice it's now looking at the luminance values for each of the shots, and this is part of how it gets rid of all the flickers. The blue diamonds on the left of each of the files, when it's checked, that becomes a keyframe, which means it's one that you will edit in Lightroom, and LRTimelapse will later build transitions between those edits. Now in step 2, we save the XMP files with the big Save button. This kicks off our first handoff over to Lightroom. Now we're going to use the big Lightroom button to drag into the library gallery view in Lightroom. You can validate you're in the library view by checking the menu at the top and pressing G to ensure that the gallery mode is selected. You then drag from LRTimelapse into Lightroom. It will import the photos that you've taken into Lightroom with the keyframes in a special filter, which you'll see me select in the bottom right-hand corner once all of the photos get loaded. Step 4, set filter in bottom right-hand corner. You see me hit the drop box. This was installed with LRTimelapse. And now you've got the keyframes that you've selected that you're ready to edit. Edit these keyframes however you'd like them to look. Keep in mind, LRTimelapse is going to build transitions between your keyframe edits. A critical point would be to make them in sequence. Start at the beginning of the sequence and edit towards the end, because after you're done with each keyframe, you're going to shift-click on the next keyframe and go to the Scripts menu at the top of the screen. This menu allows you to use the LR Sync keyframes and copy your settings from the first keyframe to the next to start as a baseline and ensure a smooth transition. You'll notice as I edit this second keyframe, I'm going to make it pretty dark. And that's because I want to give the idea that this is happening during a sunset. It did, in fact, happen around 7:30 at night, but the sun wasn't quite down far enough. So this allows me, with LRTimelapse, to fill in the intermediate values to make the scene darker and preserve some of the colors I want as I go. Now we are headed back to LRTimelapse, so we're going to go back into gallery mode in Lightroom and select all the files, and then right-click Metadata, Save Metadata to Files. This makes the data available when LRTimelapse reloads from those files. Be sure to pay attention in the top left-hand corner for the status of the saving metadata. You want it to finish before you jump over to LRTimelapse. With the metadata file saved, we now click back into LRTimelapse and click the giant Reload button on the second row in the workflow. Watch the time-lapse bar at the top to make sure it finishes reloading all of the metadata. Next, click Auto Transition to fill in the values for the files between each of the keyframes. This will build a transition from one keyframe to the next to make it smooth. Step 9, click on Visual Previews to generate the previews for the files. This inexplicably does not use a status bar at the top. Instead, it uses a green color under the frames in the image on the left to let you know it's making progress. Step 10, click Visual Flicker to enable smooth transitions between each of the frames. You may have to do this more than once, and it gives you the option to just automatically retry and refix those that aren't smooth enough yet. Step 11, reload the metadata into Lightroom and then export the files just like they're your normal photos. Now it's time for us to render. Now you can render the video directly out of Lightroom with a plugin that kicks off LRTimelapse to render it, but I much prefer the rendering engine and stabilization that's done in DaVinci Resolve. Now, before I do that, I need to reload the metadata values by right-clicking, going to Metadata, and Read From File. This reads the XMP files that were saved to the disk from LRTimelapse and gets new transition values. As they're updating, you'll notice they're applying the visual preview in my preview window. So you can track along as it goes and reads the values and then applies them. And if our calculations are right, it should get darker and darker as we get to the end of this stream. Finally, with all of the images selected, you'll see me right-click and choose Export. I'm going to export these to a file folder on my hard drive in 100% quality JPEG. This will take some time. Be sure to monitor it in the top left-hand corner of the Lightroom window. Okay, I'm the first to admit, Problem 1 is not the simplest thing in the world to solve. Problem 2, however, is handled entirely by DaVinci Resolve. There's a few settings you need to make sure that you set before you get going in Resolve. Let's review them. What we're doing is effectively adding a bunch of still images in a sequence. So let's go to File, Project Settings. We're going to set the resolution for our timeline as well as our frame rate. I typically choose 30 frames a second. And right here we're going with 4K because these photos are greater than 4K. You can speed up your rendering time dramatically if you were to set that up to be 1080p and render out of Lightroom at a 1080p instead. Now go into DaVinci Resolve and Preferences. We're going to go to the User Preferences on the Editing tab. This is important. The standard, which is the default, we're going to switch it to frames and we're going to change it to 1 frame each. That's because we're going to be adding a lot of stills and we want them to go in at 30 frames a second, 30 images per second. Now that I've got my project set up, I'm ready to add my footage. You'll notice I just dragged all of the photos from that folder into DaVinci Resolve's Media Manager. And in the media pool, it only shows as one because it realizes it's a sequence. I then drag that one clip down onto my timeline, and you'll see it's now put in sequence all of those photos. You can also tell that it gets darker over time. But there's something that bothers me about this, and it's the stabilization. It's bumpy. It was pretty windy when I shot this. So I go into my color tab down at the bottom, and then use the stabilizer, which is in the left window. It looks like a target, like a gun sight on the left. And I choose stabilizer from the drop-down list on the right side of that frame, and click stabilize. It's now looking at each of the photos. It's using the perspective stabilization, which I find works perfect for this type of thing. There's your stabilize button. It's rendering. That is where you can find your tracker, and stabilizer. Now let's check out what it looks like. Holding pretty steady. In fact, if I hold my mouse directly over the middle of one of these buildings, you'll notice that it stays in the same spot. So it's done a fantastic job of stabilizing this footage. All that's left for us to do is render and go. Go to the render tab. I set up my render. Again, this one's 4K, so I'm going to set it up for 4K. I'm going to use H.265 in the NVIDIA Invec coder. There we go. And so now it will encode this at a highest resolution. Little YouTube trick. You want to make sure that you output your quality on your local drive as big, fat, and thick as you can. So you want it to be the highest quality values as possible. You can set a constant bit rate around 100, or you can choose the presets there that were the highest value. Because YouTube's going to process and re-encode it when it gets to it. You want it to have as much data as possible going into that. You don't want to streamline it down to something really small and then let YouTube crush it again. Here we are rendering, and this should go pretty quickly. Notice it's using the graphics card quite a lot. That's in part due to the NVIDIA encoder that I chose. And let's check out the final result. I think you'll agree it's a lot better transition and it's more stable. If you want to see more of these, please like and subscribe. It makes my day when somebody subscribes to the channel, and I appreciate you watching. Thanks.